Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
Where people feel that they have responsibility for their lives, that they can make a difference, and that we can see that maybe group ownership of a project isn't just a bad way to go. It represents a different model for the entrepreneurial model that we usually think of, where one person starts a company and reaps most of the benefits and so on. That's been our general way of thinking of how we make progress.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Father Chuck Ritter, Director of the Office of Community Relations for the Catholic Diocese of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik and Father Chuck Ritter discuss poverty in the United States and a campaign for human development. Here's Father Bacik.
Chuck, it's good to have you on the program here, and I would like to take the opportunity to say what a fine job I think you've done as the Director of our Office of Community Relations. You've worked hard at it, and I think made an impact on the whole community, and you've maintained a really healthy sense of social justice throughout it. I personally have appreciated that, and I suppose one of the reasons I appreciate that is because of what I consider to be the difficulties connected with that kind of ministry, the sort of being able to persevere and sustain the effort. A lot of times I find that people who are very involved in the social justice apostolate, as we call it, or the general attempt to serve others, often feel frustration because things don't get accomplished the way we'd like to see them and so on. Very often the programs don't go as well as we would like. And so I guess I have sort of special admiration for people working in that kind of area. I can't help it. The other night we had a program in one of the residence halls, and two of my colleagues were involved in it, and it was a film on world hunger and getting ready for fast for world harvest and so on. And I think they told me that two students showed up, and two of the students had been involved in the organizing thing, and I really felt bad for them, and it sort of typified for me what seems to happen to people who are really concerned about social matters, social justice, so much failure and frustration.
From a marketing perspective, selling a film on world hunger in a college dorm is a rather tricky business.
Yeah, when they did them on personal relationships, I think they told me they had 30 or 40 people present and so on.
Right. I think, especially as church gets involved with this, there's just not the sense of that being as traditionally a part of the church agenda as concerns about worship or religious education, or even such mundane things as paying the bills and keeping the buildings functioning. And I think that what I find not frustrating but unfortunate is that in the case of the Catholic community, we work out of an extremely long tradition of that church here in the United States, and certainly in worldwide church statements and documents for solidly the last 125 years, speaking about social concerns, social ministry, social justice, and that's totally foreign language to most of our people. I was in a parish situation a number of years ago that I heard a very involved, committed parish member reduce the entire social teaching of the church to, quote, some letter some pope wrote 80 years ago. And the man certainly cannot make a part of his life something that he's not really heard as much, and at least today he's hearing it more. And I think that's, I see the excitement of the church finally coming to grips with that dimension of its identity as being the good thing, and it overrides the frustration most of the time.
Well, that might be one of the things that keeps you going, perhaps, the whole ministry.
It helps.
Well, and of course, it's not simply looking at the social teaching of the church, but it's coming to grips with the real-life situation of people. And what we're trying to do, of course, is to bring the gospel and the resources of the church to bear upon real suffering in our world. I often think of the people who are the social workers, the people helping out in soup kitchens these days, and so on, first-hand knowledge of how difficult it is to do something about the poverty, say, in our own country. We can talk about poverty in Ethiopia, and that touches us, and it's like nothing we know in this country. I mean, you see the films of those dying youngsters, and we really don't know anything like that in our country, I don't think. But we still have to face the fact that even within this country of affluence, we have tremendous poverty. I mean, isn't that amazing, the governmental statistic that says something like there's 34 million people living below the poverty line right here in this affluent country. I mean, that's by government statistics. That's mind-blowing in itself. And then I hear people talking about this and saying, yeah, well, those people are sort of shiftless, or they won't work, they don't get jobs or something. And I think the stat that I see quoted is that 90% of those people simply wouldn't be able to work. They're either too young or too old or they're disabled in some way. So 90% of those 34 million people simply couldn't hold jobs. They wouldn't be able to do anything. Now that's a frightening statistic in this great country of ours.
And I think what people find upsetting about it, apart from the fact that none of us voluntarily expose ourselves to uncomfortable, truths or situations, is that we can't figure out why it is that a system that obviously, has functioned so well and has benefited so many people, we're not willing to say that inherently there's something wrong with the system. It's like we can't account for why those people are there. That reality of those millions of folks kind of seems to represent a challenge to some basic things that we believe about our own system, and yet when we analyze even the data a little bit, as you point out, understanding that the great majority of those people are under 18 or over 65, or are people with various physical or mental handicaps, that they're not a potential part of the labor market. It's like, oh, okay, that looks a little bit different, and we've tended to take the statistics that we see and deal with them in very impersonal ways. We need to personalize the statistics.
Well, yeah, I think we do need to do that. Yeah, and that's the only way it will come home to people. Right. But it's still, I think we do have to have some sort of cool, rational sense of what our problem is. I mean, just to highlight that even more, that I think there's something like 2 million people who are employed and who live below the poverty level. I mean, they're simply not making enough to make it in our country. And think of a lot of the people that perhaps even that we know in our circles who were sort of successful people or had good jobs and lost their jobs in the recent past and had to go through this sort of hellish notion of what poverty is all about. I'm thinking of one particular man, and to try to personalize as you suggest we need to do, but I mean, I think he had a good job with a corporation for a long time and simply lost that job and couldn't find anything else. And I think he used to go help out in one of the soup kitchens around town. Even in that situation, it somehow gave him an identification with people who had always been in that state or had maybe never known anything else. It was a psychological. He used to tell me what it meant to him psychologically to be in this situation. It was just so destructive to think he couldn't bring the paycheck home anymore. He couldn't feel the sense of pride, of accomplishment, of caring for his family. And he told me about many of his friends who felt that same way. Now, here's a whole new dimension to poverty in our country, in a way.
For the people who are adults, and as we said, many of those people in that poverty statistic are children or are people beyond the working age. But if you take people in, say, the 20 to 60 age range, we identify so many of our personal identity things in this country around the work that you do. Literally, what you do, which to a great extent relates to where you live, the kind of people that you tend to socialize with, the kind of car you drive, the sort of house you live in. All those visible indications of identity are so wrapped up with job that while the employment issue is only one piece of the whole domestic economic picture, we forget the tremendous kind of impact, that being out of work or working, but it's something, that there's no connection to what you want to be doing or have talents at doing, or it's not contributing anything. The impact of that on people is just
psychologically destructive. It really cuts into one's sense of self-worth and of making a contribution to the larger world. I think in this relationship, too, we ought to mention the situation of women in our country. I believe a stat that's in the back of my mind is that 2/3 of the adults who are below the poverty level are women. And very often it's women who are supporting families by themselves. And and also we have that sort of frightening statistic that women who are doing comparable work to men are making, 69 cents on the dollar for what the man is earning. So we do have this great problem. Some people have called it the feminization of poverty in our country. We do have to advert to that as we try to look at this whole situation.
Right. And the kinds of both personal and, family responsibility pieces that are part of that package, certainly in a tight economic situation, many times either by just traditional job roles or by the education required for some kinds of positions, those folks are taking a double and a triple handicap in terms of equal opportunity to move ahead in the employment picture. The other is just the whole way in which within our own country we deal with it as a national picture, and not only the feminization but the regionalization of poverty. We used to kind of think that the pockets of poverty were either just in the big cities or perhaps, in some parts of the South or something
Appalachia.
like that. Right, Appalachia is probably the example, and yet the realization more and more is there are pockets of poverty sprinkled throughout every state of this country. It's urban poverty, it's rural poverty. Rural poverty gets hidden even more because it's sprinkled around in little pieces.
I think there's a stat I saw that 8,000 farmers lost their farms recently. There's a tremendous turnover that way. The small farmer having such a great difficulty in making it.
At a meeting just yesterday, too, where in contrast to that, the point was raised of how there is a stereotype in many parts of our society that farmers are fundamentally rich people.
Yeah.
And balance that off a statistic of the number of people losing their farms, either because of foreclosures or just the tremendous cost of getting into or staying in agriculture today. And yet that's an issue, presuming that we all eat, that directly affects all of us. And looking at what is happening to the ag economy in our country is something that 40-50% of us that live in larger cities don't even stop to take into consideration.
That's right. And I think to complete our profile, we have to keep in mind the minorities who are so often shut out of the mainstream. We think of the black teenage unemployment rate, often over 50%. Frightening statistic, I think that 1 out of every 2 black child lives below the poverty line. Half of the black children are living below the poverty line. And what does that mean in terms of the future and of creating a society and binding up our wounds and opening up the system to more people? So it's segmented that way also. And of course the dominant white middle class very often just doesn't want to look at that or really have anything to do with that.
And if we talk about an ideal national situation at some point, most of the people writing in economy are saying that when you talk about full employment nationally, you're never talking literally about full employment. You're saying that practically speaking, getting down to an actual unemployment rate of even 5%, let alone 4%, is almost the lowest figure I have ever seen. You're saying that is the best we can do. Well, now, if 4% unemployment in this point in our country means probably close to 5 million people who are potential people in the job scene and are not working, and that for every one of those you add on a number of additional, under 18 people or older, you're saying that our projected national future is to remain with perhaps 15 or 20 million people below the poverty line. And for me, at least, there's just an inherent sense that we can do better than that. But yet we're projecting a future that in effect sets up that kind of scenario as almost the best we can do. And I think that there's such a clash of reality and ideal of what our country stands for that the sense of frustration around that, I think, makes a lot of people just back off from it and say, I don't know what to do about it.
That's right, and that's exactly how many people end up feeling. And I think that's where I would like to raise something that I am proud of in our own Catholic heritage, and that is what we call the Campaign for Human Development, established 13 years or so ago, 15 years by the Catholic bishops, which were meant to address this particular problem. The Campaign for Human Development, of course, is a nationwide effort to address the question of poverty. It's primarily an educational enterprise. That is, it's trying to raise the consciousness of people about the problems of poverty, get us in touch with the kind of statistics we were talking about, and to put a human face on it so that it brings forth from us a degree of compassion and empathy. And also it is a collection, an attempt to get funds in order to fund self-help projects for the poor. I think the whole idea is not a hand out, but a hand up, helping people to break out of the hellish circle of poverty. Well, I think it's a marvelous idea, not because it solves the problems of poverty in our country, because when you get down to it, it's a drop in the bucket. What did we collect last year in the campaign? Something a little over $10 million. Now, that might sound like a lot of money, but of course it isn't when you're looking at the magnitude of the problem of poverty. But I see its advantage in another way. That is the whole educational side of it, which is not just theory, but has a practical side to it. That is, what we're trying to see is there a way to structurally do something different? Now, the kind of programs they fund are self-help programs for the poor. They're usually the kind of things where poor people get together, where they will own the enterprise themselves or take hold of a community organizing project. The Campaign for Human Development gives them some money, seed money, gets them going. But they run it themselves, and they sort of pull themselves up in a way. I almost didn't like that phrase I used there because it sounds like pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, which I don't want to get into. But it is an attempt to give them means to help themselves, and I think that's what's so good about it.
Right. I think as I have worked with the campaign at an organizational level, but even more, worked with people in some of those projects, it seems to me that the heart of CHD is the reality of the question of how people feel about themselves. And anything that we do at a level of programs or policies as a church or as a nation that in effect reinforces a stereotype that says poor people are basically lazy, incompetent, you have to do for them, perpetuates the problem. Anything which facilitates an experience where people can be in touch with their own abilities and gifts and competence to take hold of their own situation and do something to change it, not only has the immediate result of this successful cooperative or this successful housing project or this successful community organization, but it tells people something about themselves. And when people begin to look at themselves in a new way, you have a tremendously fundamental change in what's happening in society. And that's the kind of thing that it seems to me the THC is focused on.
Maybe it helps to recount one of their success stories, the way they operate. I used to live in the Bronx up around Fordham, and one of the stories they like to recount is of a self-help group there. You know, you keep seeing these destroyed buildings in the Bronx, and what happens, of course, is the land or the owners move out, just let them go, vandals come in, and you got a mess, and the tenants move out, and the whole neighborhood is gone. Well, that started to happen in one neighborhood up near Fordham University, and there was a particular woman there who Fran Sullivan by name, 40-year-old woman, who just wasn't going to let that happen. And she began to organize in a way to hang on to these buildings. And one of the things they did was get a grant from the Campaign for Human Development, so all this money collected in Catholic churches around the United States throughout the years. So for a year they'd have $10 million or so. Then they may have an administrative board that makes decisions about where that money goes. Well, they ended up giving grants of, I don't know, around $50,000 a year or something to this woman and her committee to get them going to save their apartment dwellings, so that they were able to take hold of that. They got groups that refurbish these places, and part of what they saved the whole neighborhood that way. And they felt good about it. They collect the rents now. They make sure the buildings function properly, and they feel very differently about themselves. Just what you were saying. They have now a sense of pride in their neighborhood. They're very grateful, of course, to CHD. You know, it says that the CHD is the first money that we got, and everything we've gotten since is directly related to that first money. That helped them to use to get leverage with federal things and with banks to get large, significant amounts of money. The original $50,000 didn't solve their problems, but then they could use this to get for leverage to get more money from the federal government, state government, other funding agencies, and they actually end up saving their neighbors. One woman is saying it also created a corporate spirit, as people who never worked together on anything before have a reason to cooperate. And this Fran says, as she walks through the neighborhood, says, I used to be able to walk a mile and never say hello to anybody in my neighborhood. She says, now I stop to talk 10 times every block, working together to change people as well as buildings. So maybe that puts a face on what you were trying to say, what really happens to poor when they can take hold themselves.
It does, and there's two pieces of that. One, that whole concept of that term, seed money. CHD will only fund a project with the most 3 years, and a lot of the grants only for 1 or 2 years. And one of the funding concerns is, will this be able to sustain itself in an ongoing way? If that project in the Bronx got a $60,000 grant from CHD, let's say, in the city of New York, I'm sure that you could have spent $60,000 in one day on feeding the hungry, no question, and the need was there. That $60,000 made possible. It was a piece of making possible something that's an ongoing thing that affects, dozens, probably hundreds of people, a whole area of the city. Is it worth spending money doing things like that as contrasted with the immediate direct service which is desperately needed, but which is consumed immediately? And it's that different kind of approach. They're both expressions of love of neighbor. The other is the leverage factor. That's been the case with CHD across the country, that $7 or $8 million each year that goes out in national grants is probably the leverage for 4 or 5 times that much money in funding from other sources in federal grants. And so if you want to look at a situation where the Catholic community as a fund CHD is getting maximum mileage out of their dollar, that's a gorgeous example. We can get all sorts of stuff done with that.
And I think that it's the modeling. I mean, it's a drop in the bucket in our problem, but what it represents is how things can get done. I think when poor people feel that they have responsibility for their lives, that they can make a difference, and that we can see that maybe group ownership of a project isn't just a bad way to go. It represents a different model for the entrepreneurial model that we usually think of, where one person starts a company and reaps most of the benefits and so on. That's been our general way of thinking of how we make progress. This really represents an alternate model where the workers own whatever it is that they are doing. I remember one of the projects had to do with Indians and funding a project where Indians started their own fish hatchery, I think it was, and they employed a number of people and so on, but it was worker owned and worker policed, and the policy came out of the workers. And I just believe that it's good to have that kind of alternate model available in our country.
And considering, again, that the statistics say that in terms of looking at the whole national employment situation, most of the new jobs being created in America are being created in small employment situations, firms that are employing like less than 100 people. And a whole modeling, say, of alternatives in terms of worker-owned things, in terms of cooperatives. Nobody is starting companies with CHD money that are going to employ thousands of people. But it's at a local level that interfaces with the community. The thing from the Bronx situation about being able to walk down the street. There are a lot of people who are maybe not directly involved in that project, but who simply, because they were part of the community in and around which this took place, there is a community building dimension of CHD that goes far beyond just the specific people who are on a board or a working project or something.
I must say, whenever I hear that kind of thing, it really touches my heart. It gives me hope, is what it does. That, look, if you could save 1 block, why couldn't you save 5 blocks? Why couldn't you save the whole of the Bronx? Why couldn't we, Indians have more opportunities to develop business and so on? There is a hope dimension that comes through, I think, to many of us along this line. We're talking about it. One of the things that made me very proud in reading through the national material is that a woman from your office is mentioned in here, and it's Donna Thurkelson, and it's part of the whole educational effort of the Campaign for Human Development. And one of their theories is that you will learn about poverty and the systemic and structural reasons for poverty by actually getting involved in projects. And so she was very involved in the prison reform project, as a number of people were, Father Ron Kurth and others around our diocese, and were able to learn a lot about the problems of the down and outs, the marginalized, from that kind of hands-on effort to do something about prison reform within our own diocese. So Donna's name is in here for more information, and sort of made me proud that your office had done something good along this educational line.
The whole education dimension is two things. First of all, I would have to mention that CHD nationally has won a number of awards for some of the short pieces they have put out. They've done some very effective, like short TV spots kind of things. Again, sensitizing people to the reality of what is or is not part of the situation of poverty in the United States. But the whole thing, we have found that people tend, unfortunately, to relate to the Campaign for Human Development as just a collection that takes place around Thanksgiving every year. The heart of the campaign is a whole sense of awareness of, we might call domestic poverty, the reality of what actually is the fine detail of that 34 million people in our own country. A learning from actually working with people, being involved with projects. The thing we're trying to look at here in the Toledo Diocese is to try to involve the people from local parishes in a little more contact with the projects that CHD funds here in the diocese, so that it's not simply looked at in terms of financing but in terms of a people in touch with people kind of thing. The other is we found that having opportunities for people that are in those projects to talk in churches or community groups to go out and themselves talk about that experience as they're in the middle of it. It's their story. People telling their story is a tremendously educational piece.
Yeah, they have what they call now a sort of Target 83, I think was the name of it, where various dioceses around the country tried to get more local involvement at the parish level. They talk about one group of parishioners trying to help people who lived in a tenement house near their parish or low-income dwelling, and trying to work with them on a food cooperative. And then you got a nice mixture then of those who were fairly successful in the society and along with the marginalized and alienated, and they got to know one another and things went better. So a lot of it is to try to get an educational effort going right at the parish level, I think.
The man who's the program officer for the several state area that includes Ohio just recently come from some work on the West Coast and was sharing with me some really creative things that had happened in local church organizing, parishes and local church congregations doing some things basically on a CHD model in terms of just organizing and getting at their own needs and problems and concerns as a local parish community. And while CHD certainly does not just fund Catholic things, that interface between doing that kind of thing and the local church is a part of the CHD picture too.
Well, Chuck, we've been talking about poverty in the United States, certainly not as grinding as we think of it in Ethiopia, but still very real and something that we need to address. I like what you said, that this tension between the ideal and the reality in our society, and the simple statement, couldn't we do better? And I think we have to keep striving to do better. I find hope and comfort and pride in the whole campaign for human development, our attempt in the Catholic community to collect money and educate people and provide funding for self-help programs for the poor. It does give a sense of taking hold and making a difference.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Father Chuck Ritter, director of the Office of Community Relations for the Catholic Diocese of Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections was poverty in the United States and the campaign for human development. Comments or questions on this show or suggestions for future topics should be sent to Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program is provided by the Catholic Communications Campaign of the Diocese of Toledo.